Hello, this is Saul Luckman. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Conversations on Saul Luckman Uncensored, sponsored by snooze2awaken.com, resources for lucidity. For more information about my work, including tons of cutting-edge free content, visit crowrising.com. I'm also on Telegram at t.me/saulluckman, as well as Substack at saulluckman.substack.com, where I've just released my new book, Musings from a Small Island. This self-illustrated memoir will have you alternately bursting with laughter and bursting at the seams with new perspectives on life, death, and the curiouser and curiouser cosmos we call home. For a limited time, you can laugh along with the complete text with a free 7-day trial, which will also give you access to a wealth of additional premium content. Also, please mark your calendar for Errant Fest, Decoding the Simulation to Survive and Thrive Together, coming September 22nd through 24th to a virtual location in the comfort of your own home. Stay in the loop by signing up for the chat at substack.com/chat/869093. If you're a researcher, author, influencer, or content creator interested in talking visionary fiction, energy medicine, shamanism, simulation theory, and related topics with me on this show, by all means, drop me a line. I'm also open to coming on other podcasts as a guest to drill down into what's up in the simulacrum and how we can survive and thrive here. If you really appreciate what I'm doing here, I'd really appreciate your buying me a coffee, which I'll be sure to sip in your honor at buymeacoffee.com/saulluckman. Today, I'm jazzed to welcome an old friend and colleague, Brendan D. Murphy of Truthiverse.com, whose book, The Grand Illusion, A Synthesis of Science and Spirituality, simply ought to be required reading for any and all on the consciousness path. In addition to his impressive authorial credentials, Brendan is a truly gifted musician who will be playing as well as presenting at Errant Fest. If you haven't checked out our collaborative and highly censored spoof music video, How the Deep State Stole Christmas, you can do so on my Substack, where free speech for now still reigns supreme, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Brendan also has a fantastic Substack presence at officialbrendanmurphy.substack.com, which I encourage you to subscribe to. Last but not least, Brendan's a longtime facilitator of the revolutionary healing science, Nexus Magazine, of the Regenetics Method, phoenixregenetics.org, which my partner Lee and I developed years ago and which we'll be talking about today. I appreciate you coming on the show from south of the border, Brendan. How's life in Mexico?
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. I won't complain. Mexico has its pros and cons. It's a very different lifestyle, but it's been good to us. Good to us so far.
What part are you in at the moment?
Well, we're in the state of Jalisco, if you know that. It's kind of more central. We are by the largest lake in Mexico. It's called Lake Chapala.
Yes, I spent some time in Malaki, which is a beautiful area in the Jalisco neck of the woods. It's a coastal town, and there's Barra de Navidad. It's not far from there. Very, very beautiful.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that spot, so it sounds like I should get there at some point.
Well, back in the day, this is where my son had his 3rd birthday. Is that right? Yes, it was his 3rd birthday, and so this was quite some time ago. This is like, over 15 years ago now. At the time, Milwaukee was it was very small town, undiscovered. A lot of people said it was sort of the last old school town, that felt like old Mexico, and yet it was also very beautiful in terms of the beach and had some really nice little restaurants. But it really was untouched at the time. I suspect it has changed some.
Probably, yeah. Mexico's getting less and less secret. Hey, how do you spell it, by the way?
It's Melaque.
Okay, thanks.
And
Noted.
and then Barra de Navidad is pretty self-explanatory, but that's a really cool little location. It's about 15 or 20 minutes away from Milwaukee, so
Okay, cool.
definitely recommend it. And it's year round weather in terms of swimming and that sort of thing. It's really nice even in January. It's great getaway.
Sounds like it, yeah.
What else is going on?
Oh, just the usual, running the podcast, trying to finish the second book off, the Truthiversity, keeping putting material into that. Running a separate business. Yeah, having a 2-year-old, it's just ridiculous.
That's amazing. I could see you wearing many hats at the moment.
Yeah, so they're piling up very, very quickly. The hats are stacked very high, and I'm keen to ditch a few actually.
Yeah, what are you going to ditch?
Oh man, just anything that can be outsourced at this point. I've got a guy, we've had one or two VAs who are super helpful. But we need, Amy and I both need like someone who can work at a more high level perspective on it, from more of an organizational perspective, big picture kind of stuff with us. So we're not managing every little bit ourselves.
Yeah, I know Lee and I are going through a transition process with that as well. I've never been particularly good at outsourcing or delegating, that sort of thing. And now doing Errant Fest, I actually have a little team of people who are, doing some heavy lifting, and it feels really good, I have to say.
Yeah, yeah, that's the only way you can do an event like that. So yeah, good call.
Good call. Yeah. There's no way. First of all, I don't have the skill to do some of the things that they're doing, and I don't have the time.
Yeah, and we're not supposed to wear all the hats. That's why everyone has different skill sets, so we can all work collaboratively and fill the blanks for each other.
So tell us a little bit about Truthiverse.
Podcast?
Yeah. I mean, that's
Uh,
one thing. And then there's the university piece too, right? Truthiverse.
yeah, yeah.
I
So,
suppose I'm more interested in Truthiversity because I'm aware of the podcast. So yeah,
yeah.
is it truthiversity.com?
Yes, I think it is truthversity.com. Actually, if people want a free 1 day trial, they can go to a different link, which I could dig up for you actually, for later on. Maybe not now because it's something that have to write down or
If you'll
click
send
somewhere,
it to me, I'll
But
put that
yeah,
in
we
the
do have a
show
free
notes.
1 day trial. I will do that. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of one way of introducing people to it. And yeah, I'm just kind of trickling material in there. I mean, it's sort of the place where the podcast goes there in its complete format. I share like part one publicly on places like BitChute and Rumble and Odyssey and YouTube, the dreaded YouTube. And so yeah, parts the complete deal goes in there for the subscribing members. And then we just have like 9 faculties that we're kind of going to just gradually over time build out. And it's the emphasis is the nature of reality, nature of consciousness, suppressed history, mythology, psychology, religion, this kind of stuff. Anything that branches out from those types of things. Obviously, health, terrain paradigm, anything that's like cutting edge, the next paradigm, the next phase. That's where I want to take people. So those things are my, I guess, primary, focal points. I can't work on them all at the same time. So it's just one thing after another.
Now, is it all your original work, or are you bringing in materials from other people, other videos?
I am bringing in other people's stuff because you can't do it all yourself, and there is some really solid material out there. I like the idea of having a repository of stuff that I have vetted, and I know that the people who are contributing are operating at the highest level and know what they're talking about. So I'm filtering out the nonsense and the garbage and the, all there's so much nonsense and fear porn and hype and sensationalism in the, alternative media and what have you. Never mind the normal media. So yeah, I like the idea of being able to handpick people and just go, okay, that's an excellent sort of piece on this, and I can build little modules and build little modules and courses, and I know that everything in there is compelling and high quality and that kind of stuff. And eventually, I'll turn it into like a homeschooling curriculum at some point.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. And I guess you're planning to do homeschooling?
Yeah, unschooling or homeschool. Or actually, I mean, as it happens, we're in an area where there's a Steiner school really close by, and it sounds like it, from what I've heard. I know a guy who Adam Biggleson, who actually is the holographic blood guy.
Yes.
He's actually doing a little bit of teaching there at the moment, and so I have a sort of a window in there, and it sounds quite good. It sounds like a place that we could actually send our little one to spend a few hours a day maybe, and not be concerned that her head's filled with garbage or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the Biggleson brothers, the holographic blood fellows. They've got some really interesting work, I have to say.
Yeah, and it's great. I mean, as it happens, we've got this weird little hub here in town where people like myself and Adam seem to be sort of migrating to. So it's really cool, and their work is awesome. Their work is from their, the dad pioneered it, and they are carrying the torch forward, and it's awesome stuff. It makes so much else in the like alternative health field, let alone the mainstream. Forget the mainstream, but it makes so much other stuff obsolete. So it's just great, yeah, to have access to that, and I want to get that in front of people.
Right. Have you had any personal experiences with their work other than just as an intellectual appreciating it?
Yeah. Adam did do a blood analysis for me, and I had Josh on the computer, via Zoom, doing a bit of a rundown for me. So they have done a little bit of work with me, and we'll probably do some more, because we do want to help people to understand the difference between this and the other types of blood work out there that people go and get, and to realize that if you have access to this, you don't need to waste your time with something like dark field, all the stuff, the dry blood or whatever, that people usually end up going to when they're trying to be, they're trying to find something in the alternative realm, and not go to the usual doctors and stuff, and they usually go down the dark field sort of microscopy and all that sort of stuff. But the issue with that realm is they focus, firstly, if Adam will tell you, and he's emphatic about this, he rants at me sometimes, and he's like, it's so inconsistent. Most of the people doing it have done like a 3-day course or something, and they're basically, the whole setup is designed to just sell you supplements, and from the work that they've done with thousands of people, going back to their dad 40 years ago or whenever it started, they know that supplements don't change anything in the blood. In terms of the holograms that show up, it doesn't really change anything, it doesn't fix anything. So you're not getting to the root causes with that stuff. Whereas if you look at the holograms, that's an intelligent communication from the body's informational field, telling you, here's what I'm worried about, here's what needs support, help me out with this. And then you go and you do that, and that's like, boom, now you're not wasting so much time with trial and error and throwing mud at the wall and seeing what sticks. So yeah, it's pretty awesome stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of times what they seem to come back to in terms of what ends up being the most therapeutic ends up being something on an emotional level, as opposed to emotions, not potions, right? It's fascinating. I caught a couple of their interviews where they really emphasized how even diet, if you looked at it, the larger picture of what's contributing or creating health, diet ends up being, in their estimation, about 5% of it. And
Yeah,
overwhelming majority of it is at some kind of psycho, spiritual, emotional level.
yeah, totally. And Josh said in the interview, he was like, any condition someone's got is 1,000% emotional. And that's something that a lot of people, we're still, as much as there is progression out of the established paradigms, the outdated paradigms, people are still very much focused on nutrition. They're still thinking as materialists. and thinking, oh, it's all about what I put in my mouth, and then I'll be okay. But in reality, it's not that important. The grand scheme of things, your psychological well-being. Adam will tell you, get some joy, go outside, stand in the sun, do some qigong, all this kind of stuff. Do something you enjoy. Like he's insistent, like we text back and forth sometimes, and he's like, get on your damn guitar and play some music, this kind of thing. Enjoy yourself. Like the bottom line of life is enjoy yourself, get joy. Don't be in stress, because ultimately disease is bred by this dis-ease, stress, trauma. It's all emotional. It's all psychologically rooted. So at the end of the day, if you're on top of your psychology, and I say that in the broader sense, right, like the psycho-spiritual kind of landscape, if you're on top of that, it's not that important what you put in your mouth. No, it's not as important as most people think anyway.
Yeah, and I believe it even goes into the GMO territory to a certain degree. I mean, because we're all going to be exposed to that somewhat, and people have been exposed to that for a long time. And some of the people who have been exposed to that are in very good health. And so it's not a death sentence if you have a little encounter here and there with some of these things. I think it's way overhyped. That's part of the fear porn you were talking about. You go on BitChute and you go look up GMOs, and it's just, apocalyptic basically, and I don't believe that's the case. And I also believe the body can transmute a lot of that.
And that's it. Like, if you're not thinking like a materialist, then like you said, the body can transmute it. The belief system that you have around that stuff is huge, because we all know about the nocebo effect and the placebo effect. So your perception and your feelings about things are really important. And like you said, a little encounter with this stuff is probably really not going to make much difference in the end. The body is incredibly resilient. Like, I'm always amazed at the amount of abuse people dish out to their bodies, and it still keeps ticking over. So yeah.
It's true, it really is. And in nature itself is highly resilient. I was in a recent interview, I forget which one now. I was talking about the Russian pyramid studies, where flowers, like, there was some kind of time reversal in a way, where the flowers that were growing around the pyramid actually went back to older species.
Yeah,
And
that stuff's amazing.
it's just absolutely amazing. And it also suggests that in the long run, all of these GMOs are going to be just subsumed back into natural patterns, and they're going to change right back to other older types.
Yeah, I think you're right. We've already seen the Terminator seeds they designed are already failing. They're already being rendered impotent, so to speak. So it's sort of like the intelligence that nature has, and the synergism that is part of the matrix of nature. That's not something they've been able to replicate in the lab. So it's like what they're dealing with in the lab is kind of like this simulation of nature, and it's basically an exercise in creating a form of dead things, anti-life things that can't sustain themselves. So yeah, I think in the long run that stuff is probably doomed.
Yeah, right on, right on. And the same, I know we have to tread lightly because we are on YouTube for this interview, but the same, I think, could also hold true for some of the stuff in the jabs, that the body might be able to transmute some of these things, even though people say, that it can't. Lots of people out there for a long time have been talking about these things as ultimate death sentences, but I think we both have probably observed as Regenetics method facilitators just how much healing can happen to people who have been damaged in that way.
You would know better than anyone about that.
Yes, I would know. I really, really would. I have a long story about that if you haven't checked out my books, Conscious Healing and Potentiate Your DNA. I go into great detail about my experience, and how I nearly died from that. But over the years, in addition to myself, we've seen so many people who would you would assume had some of that going on based on feedback and conversations, emails, and that sort of thing. When did it start? What's happening? When as soon as you go into serious autoimmune territory, there's a good chance some of that's happening, that there's some damage in there. It's causing problems. And to see these people who, are basically symptomatically in the ballpark of something like chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia or even more serious kind of quote unquote autoimmune conditions, to see them actually progress and move out of these situations, and then they get stronger and their allergies start to bank back, and then a few years down the road it's like it never even happened practically. I've seen that so many times. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, with the using the regenetics method, I've had a number of people report spontaneous healings of all sorts of different things, random stuff. It definitely happens. Well, there's a whole spectrum, as you know, there's a whole spectrum of effects, things you can't predict. People, oh, I've got this pain that's just disappeared. It's pain in my eye. This pain in my back's gone. My allergies aren't bothering me anymore. Like whatever it is, there's so many different things, and of course everyone has their own experience with it, so you can't predict the outcome. But it's definitely a very interesting realm to operate in, because you can't. It's unpredictable, but it's amazing what you see in people regenerating themselves, and I think the body naturally wants to do that anyway. So if you can have a modality that gives it a nudge in the right direction, which I think the regenetics method does give it that nudge in the right direction. It's like okay, we've gotten a little bit broke down, a little bit toxified, what have you. Here's a new set of instructions to operate in a more optimal way. And then, of course, as you know, a lot of people go through a very quick detox process, and they're purging those crap from their system. And yeah, I've had experience with the fibromyalgia thing, the chronic fatigue stuff. And that's connected in sometimes to heavy metal accumulation and all this kind of thing. But in the question you got to ask yourself is, well, why are you accumulating heavy metals in the first place when the person next to you isn't? Why is it one member of the family having this, but not the whole family? And it's probably down to the psychospiritual experience that person is having.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that for group one people, we have different energy families. So for the first energy family, it's very telling that the miasm for will is paired with the jab miasm. So this predisposition to weakness, and I've said a lot of on many occasions that I feel like what the jabs are doing for a certain type of person, a certain energy family, is that they're breaking people's will, and that leads to the health problems.
That's an interesting kind of line of thinking. I mean, a lot of the people who line up to take the jab and then the booster and then the next booster, I wonder what level of will someone like that actually has in the first place, because they don't obviously.
Very, very little.
Do you think that yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you're kind of agreeing, or like we're on the same page with that they probably don't have a lot of will of their own. Yeah, I'm interested in how you're kind of connecting the dots around that, and the jab and the targeting of those types of people, so to speak.
To me, it's a big separating out of the wheat from the chaff, where it's almost Darwinian. I'm not sure what the rationale or the motivation is behind it. I suspect that there's all kinds of different agendas.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that the powers that shouldn't be, they almost never do something for only one reason. They multitask everything. They get the biggest bang for their buck. Having said that, it seems to me that if you look at things just shamanically, you have multiple shamanic traditions that all are focused on power or energy acquisition, personal power or energy or chi or prana, whatever, kundalini.
Yeah.
And this is the most important aspect of those traditions. And this is not just one or two; it's a whole bunch of them that really look at our consciousness and awareness and our personal efficacy in this way, right? This is what's really important. So if you don't have a lot of power, then you can be mind controlled, you can be brainwashed, you are susceptible to propaganda, you're susceptible to gaslighting, doublespeak, all of these things. and you will go along and be a perfect little sheeple, and you'll put the face diaper on and you'll jab up and all of these things. But it really starts with the fact that you have so little personal energy to begin with, and the culture
Mm.
is kind of designed to reduce people's energy through all of the different toxins that we've talked about, but also just the way that people are conditioned to conceptualize themselves, the things that people are directed to focus on, which are totally disempowering. We don't have people, doing Tai Chi in massive stadiums and stuff. This is, if we had that going on, we're talking about a very different world. As it is, it's usually small groups who get it and they understand that, oh, I need to be cultivating my energy and my awareness. And those are often the groups that would resist some of these onslaughts that we've seen in the last few years. I have to say that I've seen a number of instances of people you would think would be the first to say no, be really big shills for the whole industry. So that's been frustrating.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I've seen the same thing. It's maddening. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, the whole will thing, and I think that those people are probably the ones, the ones who line up willingly, the ones who are kind of already broken, are probably the ones that have some of the most severe effect. But at the same time, I mean, I've seen a lot of people who had the jab, and then these are people who are like massive gym rats or massive yoga fiends, or this doctor, and these career people who are really motivated in a number of ways, and maybe really ambitious types of people, and they're out there going, everybody should go and get it, and I've had it, and then 3 days later they're dead. And it's like, it's interesting. Some of the people who line up, I think a lot of them are already, it's like there's nobody home. They've already kind of left the building. But some of them have been a bit more robust, and you would think, just on a more physiological level, not so much being awake, but just like the kind of people you'd think would be all right, sometimes have not survived. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. Why do some people seem okay? Why do others just drop off the perch straight away? It's such a mixed bag, and I don't have all the answers. All I know is that it was clearly designed to cull the herd. So they've done that. They've executed a global wealth transfer, bought up land for pennies on the dollar. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And as you said, there's multiple levels of why they do the things they do, and it was planned so long ago that it's obviously something that was very important to them to be planning it, at least 20 years ahead. So yes, it'd be fascinating to be a fly on the wall in those little gatherings.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you if you're familiar with the work of Matt over at Quantum of Conscience.
I've only just heard of him because you shared a link, and I thought, okay, well, Sol's raving about this, so I'll go and have a look. And I watched that link last night, I think. And he was talking about the Ship of Fools thing, and I thought, yeah, he's basically on the right track. He's on the money.
Yeah, right. I mean, his perspective, I mean, he started in years ago as a conspiracy theorist, right? He was trying to figure things out and going down the little rabbit holes and trying to figure them out and see if there were any connections and that kind of thing. And by looking at certain bizarre phenomena such as the Mandela effect and related effects and phenomena, he ultimately concluded that we're living in something that's just not apprehendable through science. That science is not really a mechanism for navigating in this reality, and nor is history. There's no solid ground here. It's all quicksand. It's shifting all the time, and that we have something like an adversary that's actually trying to make it that way, to make it worse, whether this is the devil or artificial intelligence X, as Jason Bashir's would call it, or the flyers or mud shadows, as the Toltec shamans would call it, whatever we're talking about, the archons, the demiurge, the Lord Archon. I mean, you've done some really great writing on Gnosticism and the archons. So feel free to chime in with all of that. But in any case, Matt is in the process of reading this book that he's been working on for a while, and he's read the first 3 chapters now. And I think he gives a brilliant breakdown of how the game is going, the game of consciousness. Essentially, he's saying that it's almost designed like a 64 team NCAA basketball bracket, right? And so the teams square off, and you start out with, 64, and then it's 32, and then it's 8, and it's 4, and then it's 2, then it's 1. And what he's doing in the process is he's showing which teams have lost, which ones have been subsumed by the narrative and trapped in one way or another. And it starts off with like your kind of absolutely brainwashed, mentally ill liberal population. That's obvious, that's easy, right? But then next in line is the conservatives who think that politics is going to save them, or that Trump is going to save them, or whatever. And then it's like the alternative people who are not able to see the forest for the trees, and all they can focus on is all the little conspiracy theories. Then it goes on and on from there, where you end up with just a group of people who are aware that they're in something like a simulation, and that we need to treat it as such if we are to win the game.
Yeah, I think that it's very much an individual game. There's not going to be a winning team as such.
Right, right.
I'd like to think that humanity can, survive itself. But yeah, I think that, it's basically the idea, the general gist of it is good. It's like you said, there's so many different ways of conceptualizing the problem and what is going on. One of the biggest influences on my thinking in the last 9 or 10 years has been my friend Nick Sambrook, who has been writing about this in novel form. So he's fictionalizing his research and insights, and his basic thesis around the adversary is essentially it's us, but it's like if you cross the veil, cross into quantum land or the astral realms and what have you. You find all these different sorts of demonic programs, all sorts of different types of informational code that show up in different ways to different people, and it's kind of like it's us on the other side of the mirror. So the adversary, as I've said for a long time, we are our own worst enemies, and it seems to me like we always have been. I mean, you take the average person, and you don't need to create an elaborate conspiracy or a clever ruse to get them to do something stupid or self-destructive. Most people line up to do it enthusiastically. So it's very easy. I think we make light work of ourselves. And I like to talk about, to come back to the stuff you mentioned about, it's all we're standing on quicksand, and this physical reality is not what it seems. It's actually just essentially a bunch of information, a bunch of data codes being decoded. But the reason it's so tricky is because it's like you said, there is no answer in the scientific realm. So where do you go from there? And I think the answer is the individual has to essentially go on this kind of personal quest and become a psychonaut of sorts. And this is what the mystics of the ages have done in their own different ways, and they've spoken about their experiences from using their own cultural reference points and language. But to get outside of the construct of the matrix, you have to experience altered states of consciousness. So the answer to the riddle, if there is ever an answer, it lies in consciousness, and because that's ultimately what is projecting the illusion of reality. So this is where I would say most of the people in the conspiracy realm never seem to get to, is that we are part of this deeper field, this infinite field of consciousness or reality, whatever you want to call it, that is manufacturing this experience here, this simulation. We're doing it. We're creating it, and we're also volunteering to be in it at the same time. So for me, there's no room for a lot of the sort of the thinking that you see. A lot of people are very embedded in victimhood, and they're like, "Oh, I'm here because the Archons forced me to be here, and I'm trapped. It's a trap. It's a soul trap," and all this kind of stuff. But I find those arguments to be very, very unconvincing.
Yeah, you've written on the the problems with the soul trap model, and I think I shared some of that on my Substack. Really, I would recommend everyone go over to Brendan's Substack and just read some of these articles on archons and soul traps and mysticism. It's really really good stuff. I don't want to do it an injustice by pretending that I could give you a fair impression of this pretty meaty work that he's putting out there.
Yeah, I don't know if I could do it either. But yeah, it's I mean, this is it. Like, this is where, all my kind of my general thrust has always been moving me in this direction. And my starting point was the mystical sort of, for want of a better term, the mystical experience. So for me, my starting point was getting out of the matrix right from the beginning and having this experience of infinite consciousness. And that's something that I know a lot of people can't relate to. And if you can't relate to it, then you'll probably find a lot of these other more limited types of ideas to be more convincing. But if you can touch infinity, then you realize the only thing that exists is you. So the only things that are created were created by you. And if you're inside of them, playing the game and being an avatar or pretending you're an avatar and what have you, it's on some level, it's a choice. It's always a choice to be here and experience this. So, I think also it's quite intimidating as well to ponder the concept of infinity, because that's so open. It's so open-ended, and that can be intimidating. It's like, well, what? It's like, what happens when you're not attached to a body anymore? What happens to you? Well, you have a lot of options. You could rejoin the simulation. You could grab another body, occupy another body, come back. The evidence for reincarnation is absolutely overwhelming at this point. Not that I'm advocating that you should, it's just that it's one option. And the thing is, because we exist inside of infinity, we have literally an infinite number of options. So I don't see that there's anything else to do other than for whatever the source of reality is, whatever that creative spark is. What choice does it have but to create? What choice does it have? If infinity is the starting point, what choice does it have but to create duality and relativity and the smaller types of things to experience temporarily, so it can explore itself and find out about itself in different ways, experience itself differently. I can't see a logical way around that.
I can't either. I've just done an incredibly deep dive into Castaneda's work and the Toltec shamanism in that lineage. And I've basically gotten to almost the end of my reading map. I've read just about everything that applies to that. And I've been doing some reading in an alternative lineage that's has been publicized by Sergio. I think his name is Magana, and he has. Let me see if I can verify that before I get people off on the wrong path. He wrote a book several years ago called The Toltec Secret Dreaming Practices of the Ancient Mexicans, and his name is Sergio Magana.
Okay.
And he was called by one European magazine the new Carlos Castaneda and this kind of thing. So what he's laying out is a different lineage, a different understanding of the world to a certain degree, but it's another one of these Toltec lineages. And he goes into all the Nahuatl and all the old language, the linguistics, the etymology of so many different things. It's absolutely, it's not a super long book, nor is it very complicated, but it's packed with information. And in that work and in this cosmology, they arrive at exactly the same conclusion, that you start with something like, an infinite consciousness, God, source, the creator, the eagle, whatever you want to call it. And to experience novelty and to learn about itself, it created all of this. And we were like its probes into experience, and then it has the ability to then bring us back through the death process and harvest our experience, our knowledge, our awareness, even our energy, and recycle it. And whether that ends up being in reincarnation or however that works, or if we are pushed out into another world, that's a possibility as well. But I find it amazing that you have these lineages that don't have a lot in common in many ways, but that they have some core pieces that are absolutely congruent. And then this piece about this creative consciousness then starts to line up with many other traditions all around the world that are, tremendously, like vastly separated from Mexico.
Yeah, like the Vedanta, Buddhism, this kind of stuff. The root of all the different mystical traditions and shamanic traditions seems to be basically there's a starting point of a field of consciousness, and then from there it's like, well, like you just illustrated my point. Like there's no logical or way around the basic sort of premise of what I'm saying. Once you hit infinity as your starting point, as your foundation, your ground, there's no logical way around it. It has to be a process of creating temporary constructs, if you want to use that language, to then, associate and identify with temporarily. So, I get to pretend to be Brendan Murphy for a lifetime, on this Earth construct. And then, like you said, death process, the information is harvested, the unit of consciousness is not lost. And that's what the realm of near-death experiences and related types of mystical experiences shows us, is the unit of consciousness is more, it's kind of like you can think of yourself as a fractal, and the physical level is one level. It's like the lowest level of the fractal, and then you go up the spiral, up the spiral, and then you have like the astral level of the fractal, and you have like the mental and the causal level of the fractal, and it just goes up. So we have all these different versions of ourselves kind of nested inside of each other. And the higher, if you like, the higher you go, or the deeper you go, depending on how you conceptualize it, eventually you get to this realm that people just call, God or creator or source. And yesterday, just yesterday, we had a little group. Someone came down from the what's it called, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and IANS for short. And Deirdre, and she came down and had a little bit of a talk with about a dozen people there, and she was sharing her experience. Everybody shared their own various types of experiences, and hers was quite profound. It was a multi-layered experience that drawn out over a few days and had different stages to it. One of the stages was she was separated from her body. Initially, she had sort of what most people would probably call like an out-of-body type experience. She was kind of like doing like somersaults in a non-physical way and just going like, oh, where am I? What is this kind of thing? And then eventually it moved into she was cradled, as she put it, cradled in the hands of her creator. And it was like the most, as she's saying this, she's in tears, because it's the most moving experience she's ever had. And it is generally, if you talk to people who've had these types of experiences, when they get to that level where it's like they make direct contact with what they call the creator or the source, the feelings of love and just complete and utter acceptance and love are so completely overwhelming and so profound that they're never the same again. So there's something very consistent with the pattern in general. As people go deeper into these types of altered states of consciousness, because that's what a near-death experience is, and you don't have to die, you don't have to be clinically dead to have this kind of experience, which I've documented very heavily. They go to a place eventually where it's like oneness, infinite, the expansiveness is completely overwhelming, and just to know that they're completely loved and held and accepted, and that they're home, and people use the word home a lot. That's, it's undeniable. And when you get to that place, when you're at that level of reality, whatever you want to call it, all these other ideas about archons and the flyers and the parasites and demons and that stuff is no longer relevant, because it's not there anymore. It's just that's all very like kind of low level, like astral. I call that realm, I call it the astral fantasia, because there's so much nonsense in there mixed in with elements of truth. And it's this world where we can easily deceive ourselves, and we're looking at ourselves on the other side of the mirror, showing up as gray aliens, showing up as demons, showing up as reptilians or what have you. But I think that it's people, and Jason Brashears has talked about this as well. People tapped into the nervous system and the wiring of the nervous system as it interprets data in the quantum field. It tends to conjure some very weird and wacky stuff. And if you can separate from the physiological, avatar and experience consciousness without that filter, and then you can go much deeper and have some much more profound experiences where that stuff gets filtered out. And that's really the stuff that I have more experience with. I'm not one of the sort of astral travel types.
Right. You made me think about the way in some of the traditions people can get lost in the astral or in the dream world in the shamanic tradition. They can literally get lost, or they can just lose their way, and they end up spending all of their time and energy in that fun house without actually getting themselves together again and moving forward to the greater goal of returning home, or connecting with infinity. You can just get lost in the funhouse. I think that's the danger of the astral realm, the dream realm. It can also be very empowering, and it can be a wonderful place to hone your skills, build your power and energy, and even your knowledge to a certain degree. And it can be a place where you can, like in Maganya's work, you can go into the dream realm, and he's teaching you how to sow healing, like as in the form of dreams. And then you practice going and digging up those dreams of healing, and you do that for long enough and you will be healed.
That's
That's
cool.
that's a powerful use of the dream realm. But then there's all this gobbledygook going on in there as well, because it is this ultimately malleable kind of freakscape of the mind.
It really is. Freakscape is a beautiful word for it. And the thing is, when you can, okay, let me give people an example, and I've documented this, and I've repeated the documentation of it in book 2 as well, because it's so important to get this and drive this home, that you can give somebody in remote viewing. This was done in the realm of remote viewing, and so some of these more well-known guys, the American Sci Spies, they were friends with each other, and a couple of them decided to play a prank on one of them. And so they handed him an envelope, and inside of it was a piece of information that pertained to the target they wanted him to remote view. And they didn't tell him what it was, obviously, and that's how it works in remote viewing. Often they have things like coordinate remote viewing, where someone just receives a set of coordinates, and then they have to send their mind there and perceive what's there. So he's given this envelope, piece of information, and he goes off and he starts his process of remote viewing this thing. And the long story short of it is he's baffled, he's mystified. He sees like a hint of red, like some guy in a red suit, bits and pieces of other information, and then he starts to pull a bigger picture together, and he realizes he's been remote viewing Santa Claus. So this is the thing, and now I've just remembered, I think they told him, he may have known, he was looking for a dangerous terrorist, some sort of terrorist, right? So it turned out the terrorist was wearing this red suit, and it was Santa Claus. So this is the issue with that kind of thing. When you're still plugged into the human nervous system and you're playing that kind of game in the astral fantasia, you can be really seriously misled, and people too often don't realize that appearances there can be very, very deceiving. And that can apply to virtually anything. So it's something that, yeah, like you're saying, you don't want to be stuck there. You don't want your growth or awareness to be, stopped at that stage. You definitely want to move past it. And, when you touch infinity, it kind of puts all that stuff in perspective.
Right, right. It seems to me that some of the areas of the problem spots with people interacting with the dream world or the astral world, would be channeling is full of problems. Ufology, all of that whole world, that whole narrative is just riddled with inconsistencies and weird stuff. Really, what other areas are subject to? I mean, any kind of quote unquote mysticism or spirituality is fair game.
Completely, yeah. Yeah, where do you want to go? I mean, the astral fantasia is pretty ripe.
It's true. It's true. Those are some problem spots that have touched on, my work over the years, and I run into things that people are saying, and I'm like, come on, just give me a break. I mean, yeah, in a way, I support the idea that we're making it all up, so we can just make it all up. I understand that. But I also believe that we're working within a shared framework, and there are some things you can make up and some things you can't. It's like Neo in the Matrix. He has to figure out which rules he can bend and which rules he can break.
Exactly, and it is a shared framework. You're right. The fact that you and I can sit here and say that we're talking to each other and be in agreement about that proves that there is some kind of, either there's a shared reality, a shared reference frame, or that maybe I take a more paranoid approach and I'm hallucinating this whole thing with you, and you're just a figment of my imagination, or I'm a figment of your imagination, and you go into this weird sort of solipsistic black hole and you never come out. But yeah, if you're rational about it, we operate in a shared reference frame, so you can't just make up whatever you want whenever you want. It doesn't work like that. It seems, that's the problem with the astral fantasia, is it facilitates people's fantasies. And so, they'll see the weirdest things you could possibly imagine. They'll treat it as if it's an objective fact, that this is actually happening as it appears to be, rather than interpreting it from a place of, well, what does this represent? Is this part of me that I've disowned and it's now showing up as some kind of weird creature? Because that happens, and this is documented. I provide examples of it. One example is Bruce Moen, who worked with Robert Monroe from the Monroe Institute, right? So the whole, they're experts in the realm of the astral fantasia and getting around in it. And he once worked with somebody who was an old man who was on his way. He was on his way out. He was on his way to dying, and he was having these dreams every night. He'd have these horrific dreams. He'd be shouting and yelling and flailing about every night. He couldn't sleep properly because of these horrendous nightmares he was having. So what Bruce Moen did, there's too many Bruces in my head. So what Moen did was he went, basically astral traveled to him in the night while this guy was asleep, and he found him there being attacked by a wraith-like being, a banshee type creature. And this thing was up in the, hovering above him and then swooping at him, and he's cowering, he's terrified. And it just keeps repeating. This thing swoops at him, and what he realized was that this banshee was literally a manifestation of the old man's fear of dying, and he was terrified of dying. He was kind of avoiding it, and so in his sleep, in his dreams, it's in a very symbolical kind of anthropomorphic way, it's trying to make itself force its way into his awareness. So it shows up as this terrifying banshee. And he, Moen figured out by talking to the guy in the astral state and calming him down and all this stuff, that this was the problem. He was manifesting unconsciously a thought form entity, an egregorial or tulpoid, as the Buddhist tradition refers to it, if memory serves me. So this is the thing we're doing. We're all doing this all the time. Every thought manifests at another level of the fractal as something weird. Like it might be a geometrical form. It might be a weird creature. But often people tune into this level of the imaginal realm, and they see this stuff and they go, oh my God, I'm being attacked by aliens. And it's like, let's just take a breath and take a step back. It's probably not that. And one of the really interesting things that I've written about from going back a few years now is you can even generate unconscious thought forms directed at somebody without having any awareness of it. Like if I think a hostile thought about somebody, I'm angry at someone, there is immediately a thought form, in whatever form it takes. It might be an alien, it might be a lightning bolt or whatever, that goes to them and attacks them, figuratively speaking, attacks them. So it's a symbolical representation of a psychological process, and taking it at face value is generally not a great idea.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. It makes you wonder why people like Bill Gates are still walking around.
How can you survive that level of psychic attack? It's unbelievable.
The old man who was afraid of his death. I thought you were going to say that they concluded that Mueller concluded that he had watched too much Harry Potter and was being attacked by a Dementor.
Yeah, it sounded a bit like a Dementor. Yeah.
So you used the word fractal a couple of times in this conversation, and we also talked about the holographic blood work at the beginning of our chat. And for me, that is a really fantastic indication that we are in some kind of simulation. You cannot have this holographic stuff showing up in blood in a normal Newtonian organic universe. It just doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And it is proof that we exist inside of a hologram. But the simulation is holographic in nature. And that's where, if people can start to connect those dots, which is what I was trying to do in book one, then they can start to exit the astral fantasia, the paranoid, oh my God, we're in an archontic slave colony, all this kind of thinking. Because you realize that the fractal stuff, the holographic stuff, the consciousness stuff, it all pulls together to create a much more empowered vision where we are the creators of our reality at the most fundamental level. I don't mean like the Pollyanna, la-di-da, life's fantastic, I'm like broke, I'm living in a box under a bridge, I'm so abundant, not that kind of create reality, but the actual fundamental essence of reality is consciousness, and we are all part of that consciousness. We're expressions of it. And the fractal thing is, we are fractal in the sense of that ties into infinity. Fractals are infinite. There's no end, there's no beginning, and that's the same as us. There is no end, no end to us, no beginning to us. We will always have different layers of self, different selves to explore with, to be a part of. And I forgot where I was going with that, but it was sort of like you mentioned something along the lines of, oh yeah, the holographic blood and the living in the simulation. Feel free to get back on track there because I like what you were saying.
Yeah, I was sort of taking the discussion in the direction of evidence for the simulation as you see it, right? And so the blood was an obvious one, but I know you've been tracking down this way along this path for quite a while. What other evidence for simulation concepts in terms of the construct could you briefly share? Because I know you know a lot about this territory.
Well, I mean, my approach to it has always been more as a mystic psychonaut type of character. So for me, it's always rooted in consciousness and rooted in infinity. So the fact that reality is mutable, that reality is, I mean, all of quantum physics supports the simulation theory, because if you look at the quantum mechanics stuff, there is no fixed time. There's no fixed future. So literally we could be in a present that is just one, branching off of many different possibilities. We could have, like Philip K. Dick reported that he had memories of a completely different timeline, not a past life, but this life, but a completely different version of it where he was living in a dystopia.
And Man in a High Castle is sort of about that.
Yeah, it is. It is exactly. That's what it's based on. So he had memories of this, and the Mandela effect is kind of another piece of information that proves that we're in a kind of a simulation. Again, a consciousness generated hologram, aka simulation, where what was I going to say? The Mandela effect. Yes, that's interesting as well, because then you have groups of people who are in the minority, but still groups of people who remember the same thing, the same piece of information, but it's not documented that way. We can't find the evidence of it. So why are they having this experience collectively, like Mandela's death? In most of them remember it as happening in the 1980s sometime. He died in prison in the 1980s. But that we know in terms of our actual documented manifest history is not what happened. So that's a very interesting thing that could be interpreted as evidence for what Philip K. Dick was basically saying, and what some of these simulation guys are saying about multiple different timelines, and we're just in one of the timelines. The other timelines got pruned. We are in this consensus one. That other one that we remember was one that got maybe, I don't know, like redacted. We edited it out. We tried again. We reset the simulation. It was from memories from a parallel time stream. So maybe it completely, existed in its own separate right. There's different ways of looking at it. There's some really odd, interesting historical events, people experiencing the past, walking into a scene from the past and just going, where the hell am I? And I've documented that in book one, and that is an overlapping or a parallel of two different, if you like, time frames that now exist in the same reference frame, which is bizarre. I mean, it suggests that we live in some kind of illusory holographic construct, and that different parallel, holographic constructs can actually, if you like, collide or share information and create these bizarre experiences. So yeah, I think there's a lot out there if you start, collecting it.
I know that Castaneda, when he was, well, there's a book by Armando Torres, a recent book, and he was sort of a student, quote unquote, of Castaneda's later in Castaneda's life, and he ended up recording his conversations with Castaneda, and he reported, the dead zone in Mexico where compasses do all these wild things and electronics stop, up in the northern part of Mexico. Have you heard of that area?
I don't know much about it, actually.
So it's one of these famous places where just nothing, you can't get cell phone reception, just and electronic equipment just goes crazy and batteries do strange things and all this. And Castaneda described that as a place where you have the eagle's emanations. So the eagle is their word for the creator, which would ultimately be some, in the model we've been discussing, it might be some aspect of ourselves, right? That we end up, that's kind of like home base. There's a band of emanations that are actually what we perceive as time, and that emerges from the eagle to create these constructs. And there are places on the earth, and I think about Sanderson's work with the 12 Devils graveyards and all this stuff, all the geometry that we see and the weird anomalies that happen around these nodal points, around this place that we live on. The places where the emanations cross, where there's like more density of certain kinds of emanations, create these weird zones. And what you're basically doing is you're taking these energetic emanations, you're kind of crossing them in a grid-like pattern, and where they flow over each other, you get anomalous regions where it's almost like there's an overload of temporal energy, and it short circuits the whole spot.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think I'd probably enjoy this.
Something's creating that grid-like phenomenon. I don't know. We have a lot of people from the flat Earth community watching this or whatever. I like Jason's take that if anything, we're looking at some kind of simulated environment. So arguments about globe versus flat really don't, hold a lot of water for me. But in any case, it is fantastic that they can at least create mathematical models that show this.
Yeah, and where to go from there? I think that, like we said earlier, we're in a shared reference frame. The geometry thing is proof of, at the very least, intelligent design. And the fact that we are finding geometry at every scale of existence, not just on the planet, but around us I know people have developed a weird aversion to the word space, but for lack of a better term, in space, the structures in space, the entities in space, are also arranged geometrically. So we live in this sort of harmonic geometric construct. Obviously, there's an intelligence behind that, but again, people get stuck on a very limited reference frame. It's like they get fixated on things like, well, we live in a realm. The Earth is a realm. Well, the Earth is a shared reality in a broader shared reality called the universe, which is part of a broader shared reality called the multiverse, which is part of a broader shared reality called the omniverse. So it's just a matter of building. I think we need to work on building perspective, methodically, and connecting the dots and building context, which is something that I think, it's probably easy for like you and me to talk about that and to say that, because this is kind of what we do. And I don't have to get up tomorrow and go to a job from like 9 to 6 or 9 to 5 or whatever. So it's easy for me to have that mentality. That's just my mentality, and I'm good at it if I do say so myself. And you can relate to that, and that is not something that is very common. I'm finding that it's even in the alternative realm, the truth community. I would say that anyone who functions in that way in a competent manner is in a small minority, and that makes it difficult to move the discourse and the discussion forward, at least as far as like inside of the popular kind of framework. It's easier for me to go and share an article on academia.com and talk to 75-year-old PhDs, which I've had multiple of them want to co-write something with me, or want to have a conversation with me, or what have you. And it's like, oh, okay, well, these are my people. So,
That's cool.
it's a higher level of discussion, but that's why talking to someone like yourself is refreshing as well, because we can kind of meet on the same page and understand and listen. And we don't have, I think the listening ability is a fundamental problem as well for a lot of people. They get so stuck on their own ideas and preconceptions, even when their preconceptions and ideas are rooted in a radically alternative viewpoint compared to the mainstream. They still develop a listening problem, and then don't comprehend what somebody like yourself or myself is actually saying. So that's a problem as well. People need to develop a certain kind of like a mindfulness practice around monitoring themselves. And if anyone wants to go and take a landmark course, that's actually what they train you to do, is actually how to listen, because a surprisingly high number of people actually don't know how to do it properly.
It's so true. I feel like you know we are, in some ways, we're dealing with a language problem, as well as the actual nature of the language, and then the listening problem, and people are triggered. And so as soon as people are triggered, then they're not hearing anymore, right?
Yeah.
And I've been analyzing this. I wrote an article on the kind of spun off of one of your articles, and the whole concept was, is the scientific method broken, or did it never exist in the first place? And it gets into this problem of communication. I wrote in there, I said, um, um, so worldview is a key word in this discussion, as it reminds us that each side of any debate or conflict, including the one about alleged viruses, is creating the world it sees. Specifically, the simulation feeds to each side data and quote unquote quote facts that support the latter's their beliefs. This literally means that people who are sort of pro-virus may actually be seeing and evaluating different evidence from that presented by to the other team. And then we end up in this kind of Tower of Babel situation where literally they can't understand each other because they're getting different reality feeds.
Yeah.
There's any chance that could be happening, or is there, I know, because I know that you've done really, really good work in this area, in the whole terrain world. So I hope I'm not stepping on your toes at all, but I'm just wondering, in the scope of this conversation about the primacy of consciousness and perception, could we be dealing with some kind of archontified AIX reality that's giving people different feeds, and the reason they can't communicate is that they're playing slightly different versions of the simulation?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, ultimately, psychology and quantum mechanics have led us to the same weird place where we can only really discuss reality as a perceived construct that exists in the mind. So in that sense, I would agree. I agree. And, people, if what exists in the mind, if the images in the mind are the only thing we can call reality, then ultimately, yeah, people are inhabiting completely different realities. And therefore, what they're saying to each other is going to be problematic. Like, the communication divide is huge. I also think at the same time, like we said, we live in a shared reference frame, this holographic projection generated by a field of consciousness, this great mystery that we'll never fully understand while we're attached to our human biosuits. And in that sense, it's obvious for me, looking at dozens of different fields of research over the years, that it doesn't matter which one you point to. I mean, it's easy for us to talk about the virology issue because that's very topical. So we can use that as an example. And what's become obvious to me is you can have people looking at the same exact data, the raw data, the same exact information, but having very, very different interpretations of it. And yes. Most of the reason that people, like virologists, like Dr. Stefan Lanka will tell you that he is, I mean, firstly, he's a qualified virologist who no longer refers to himself as a virologist, because he understands the problems with the model and he doesn't want to be identified as such. And he can explain to you the problem with the way that virologists work, and that the way that they are indoctrinated into seeing reality a certain way and to approaching it with certain methods, and then applying specific types of interpretations to those results, and it's just blinkered. It's just being blinkered, and so there's no other possibility in those types of conditioned minds for seeing a different outcome, for seeing a different reality. They cannot do it. That's because beliefs dictate perceptions. So when we talk about it, and if we posit that there's an external shared reality, is shared reference frame, the problem is that people's beliefs cause them to interpret that data, that incoming information, in a certain type of a way. And very often you find people who are incapable of actually engaging with any kind of objective, rational, evidence-based reality. You know, there's some very, very, like, you would have seen them in doing what you do. We've both seen them. There's very unhinged people out there who have a very slender grasp on anything we could call reality, and they just see and hear what they want to see based on their belief systems, and that's it. So you can never get anywhere with those people, and that it describes basically everyone who has invested, particularly virologists, who has invested in the idea of, you know, pathogenic viruses. So that's just as an example of what you were talking about to begin with.
Yes, yes. You know, listening to Quantum of Conscience in his new book, and just digesting this radical view of the simulation, there's at least a part of me, and I hear everything you said, and I don't disagree with it. I just don't know. But there's a part of me that thinks that it could be even weirder, that the way that we are projected as people to people perceiving us changes from the way we intend to be perceived. There's a great Russian philosopher, kind of a literary scholar and philosopher, named Bakhtin, who wrote an amazing collection of work called the dialogic imagination. And it's this idea that we are communicating with other consciousnesses, ultimately back and forth through a shared field of imagination that we both control at the front end, right? And then it goes over and then it comes back. And so it's very, very complicated. So a scenario in the dialogic imagination view would be, you know, I posit scientific theory X, I can show you the data, and then you are acting like an idiot. But really, what that person is receiving is different data, because it's coming into a different feed. It's not only being interpreted differently, they're actually getting different data, because the reality is in flux, and it's that quicksandy thing. And then they look at what's being presented to them as evidence as anything but, because they literally are getting a different data feed. And there's just at least a part of me that wonders if something that radical could be occurring, because the divide is so massive. The Tower of Babel is in such full effect, such full swing, that it's hard to imagine that this is just some basic misunderstanding based on belief.
I actually empathize with that to a point. I think there's truth to that. It's just that I know people from a human psychology point of view at this point, that from observing for the last 20 years, the way that people talk themselves into something and latch onto a belief, identify with it, interpret everything and filter it through that belief. So it's like, in a way, you know, we're kind of saying the same thing. Like, if I hand you a sheet of paper and we both agree that, you know, it's got X, Y, Z on it and blah, 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 that's one thing. But if I hand you the sheet of paper and you're like, oh no, it says ABC, that's a problem. And that would be extremely bizarre. So I don't know to what extent that situation might pertain or apply in the world in general. But
we do have like the Voynich manuscript, right? Are you familiar with that? That doesn't correspond to anything that we know, but it appears to be straight out of some kind of parallel or alternative reality. It does suggest that we might have completely different scenarios playing out just right beside us. And I think if those beams ever cross, then we get Tower of Babel, we get confusion. It's almost like the eagle's emanations crossing and just creating a dead zone where there's just no there.
Yeah. I'm pretty sympathetic to that kind of idea, because, you know, if you look at the Mandela effect, that's kind of is the same kind of idea. You know, there's this bleed through of a completely different reality, so completely different data. You know, why do these two groups of people have completely different sets of memories when we supposedly all inhabit the same reality? That's that's kind of weird. And there's something very strange going on there.
Yes.
So I think it's kind of all of the above, and it needs to kind of be assessed on a case by case basis. Human psychology is so fundamental. It's like as soon as someone has belief, that's it. They do receive different data to someone who holds a different belief. That's the essence of the virology problem here. Is the data being received is being filtered through this belief system versus the data over here being received through a different belief system. Therefore, the two camps are literally receiving different information because they're constructing different information. So their consciousness encounters a different data set. And that is dictated by belief, essentially. So yeah, I think it's all of the above, but just to continue down that line of thought.
Yeah, right. It's interesting when I see such a radical divide, a dualism, it leads me to believe that neither side is right, because we see this in politics, which side is right politically. Well, it's just a dualism. And it makes me think that you have like the Germies, they're wrong, and then the Terranies, they're wrong too, and that maybe the Bigglesons are much closer to what's actually happening, and it's a psycho-spiritual astral dream body kind of thing that's projecting our realities, and it doesn't have a lot to do with terrain or pathogens. It's totally psychic.
Well, the thing is with me and the Bigglesons, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but definitely with me, when you say terrain, I'm talking about the psyche as the fundamental.
You
Um,
are, but a lot of people are not. They're really talking about the microbiome and its relationship to the environment.
yeah, and the thing is, from where I'm at, and people like Adam would agree, when you get to a correct understanding of the terrain paradigm, there is no room for pathogens. There's no room for viruses. Adam's never seen an image of a virus
Right.
in 60,000 slides. If viruses were real and causing problems in people's bodies, why is it the body keeps projecting holograms of all these other things that need attention, but not a single virus ever? Why is that? And you made a point earlier, just a moment ago, which I wanted to touch on because it was that dualism thing. Like again, I agree. And then at the same time, it's like, okay, but if we want to operate on the premise that there is some kind of possibility of an accurate understanding, or if we want to adopt concepts of right and wrong, if we want to use categories of right and wrong, we could say, okay, well, there's a group of people in the world who believe in Santa Claus. They're convinced he exists, and they're convinced that the presents at the bottom of the tree were put there by Santa Claus. That group of people is called children. In the adult world, I don't think you'll find a lot of people who agree that Santa exists, because they're the ones putting the presents under the tree.
Right. Right.
So it's
Yeah.
kind of like I think it's both. It's something we have to navigate, and it's that fluid terrain. Always got to check ourselves, monitor ourselves. Not many people are good at that. So self awareness is really really fundamental, and that's why it's so important for people to work on themselves, do the shadow work. Get rid of your attachments and your egoic investments in your petty identity stuff. None of that helps. None of that helps in developing the ability to weigh and measure and contemplate things and reach in principle what might be a more accurate version of reality. Maybe the model that we have in our mind can be improved. That's kind of where I said it's like whatever we think is reality around us is a model ultimately in our minds, and the goal is to try to get that model to be an accurate reflection of whatever the real reality or truth might be, if there is even such a thing out there.
Yeah, I think from a shamanic perspective, there's not. It's all mysterious ultimately. And like Don Juan would say, build your inventories, which is your model, and then
Yeah.
burn.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's it.
But
That's it. That's
the
as soon as
activity of the activity of building the inventory, which is a worldview, is not without merit. It helps you learn to think. It helps your will. It helps the various parts of you. There's nothing wrong with it. But when the worldview turns into belief, blind belief, and then you go about constructing your paradigms based on that, then we're in hot water.
exactly. So it's like build your models, build your paradigms, don't get attached to them. There's always going to be more information. You're always going to have to change, or you'll be left behind. Flex with the times, be adaptable, all this kind of stuff.
Now you mentioned the shadow work. I was wanting to say earlier when we were talking about time, and I was going back to regenetics where we started, that it's a very common occurrence for the the regenetics activations to start before the actual sessions. Have you seen this happen? Like there's almost like
Yeah,
a retro causality thing going on, or the opposite.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I have. One woman emailed me or messaged me somewhere to say that she, I think it was an hour before we actually did the session, that she bizarrely basically went blind. Um, and it resolved itself. We did the session. She got her vision back. It was completely normal. But yes, I've heard of these strange things happening or people sensing energy before we've actually started. So yeah, there's something interesting about that because it's like, in that time space reciprocal model that you've talked about and I've talked about. On the other side of the veil in time space, there's just this immediacy. There's past, present, future, all sort of co-present, coexist. So if you can, in a way, a method like the regenetics method, I think helps us to thin the veil in a manner of speaking, so that we can then have these weird anomalous experiences with time.
Have you seen the work have benefit for the shadow stuff that you were mentioning? Have you seen it help people move through shadow self issues?
It does. It brings stuff up. I'm sure you've seen, I'm sure you've had lots of feedback around that. So I want to ask you, but I've seen it bring stuff up for people that then, they have the opportunity to integrate. It might be like old emotional stuff or anything that's, something that's been suppressed or buried. It's like, I use the analogy of the little snow globes, and you shake the snow globe and all the little bits of snow go everywhere. It's sort of like that. That seems to be what this work does on one level. It shakes the auric field up, the information starts to come to the surface, and then people can have an opportunity to integrate it. So I guess that, in a way, that's probably, people don't often share necessarily their deepest, darkest secrets with me. But I'm sure if I went through my emails and comments in the forum, I'm sure I'd find more stuff around shadow integration specifically. But what about yourself?
Yeah, it's very common. I like the snow globe analogy. It does seem to be that it does something with the energy field, the blueprint, whether you look at that as shaking it up or shamanically, you might be taking areas of kind of stuck energy and getting them moving again, whatever, however you want to look at that. And then with that, you often get memories and experiences and traumas that begin to surface that make themselves available to be healed one way or
Mm.
another. Sometimes it seems like they just kind of go away. And
Mm.
sometimes people realize they're there and it's like, oh shit, I need to work on this. And then maybe they go to somebody else to help them on this issue. I've always said causality is such a problem with this work because often it creates this breadcrumb trail that people just start following. It initiates a kind of pulse. It puts them on the path. And then years later, they've done 15 different things, and they wouldn't say necessarily that regenetics healed them or transformed their lives, but it started the process that did.
Mm. Yeah, you're right, and that's the issue with this kind of work in particular. Like causality is often very hard to pinpoint because you're talking about someone's entire reference frame for reality being altered, and then everything that happens after that point, like synchronistically things start to shift. But it's like there was just this one moment, this one lightning strike moment where we did the ceremony, and then all this other stuff like flows out of this, and you can't predict any of it, and you can't necessarily point back to the regenetics method and go, that was it. But like it's like the whole tapestry has shifted, but where do you make those connections and the causal connections? It's really, yeah, it's not easy at all.
Yeah, I ultimately tell a lot of people, when we have this type of conversation, that it doesn't even matter. Who cares, really? I mean, the egoic part of me would love to be able to say, yes, I absolutely was regenetics, my work or whatever. But mostly I just don't care. And I care less and less as time goes by. I just like to see people living better lives. That's very, very gratifying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that sums it up. That's the whole point of the work, as far as I can tell. So, I've had people. I actually use a couple of testimonials, repeatedly from people who had just mind blowing experiences, like their entire life just shifted so rapidly on every level, and it's kind of when you see that, it's like, well, the odds of that being coincidence are extraordinarily thin, very low. So those instances are very, very powerful. But yeah, when someone has like for me in my detox, I don't know if this is typical of group 3, EM group 3. You can tell me, but I had like an 8-month delay, and then it kicked in, and it was so far after the potentiation that it took me a few days to figure out what was happening and try to. That was when I realized, oh my god, this is the detox thing kicking in, and that was the only thing that made any sense of the symptoms I was having. So yeah, any thoughts around that?
How long did that go on?
I think maybe a few days.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it lined up with your schematic or whatever, and it made sense.
But the only way I could make sense of it was to, attribute it back to the Regenetics detox.
Yeah, we
Um,
have we have such weird things, like you're saying, you can't really predict it. I know that one of the other facilitators of the method, there's a bunch of different facilitators living in different places, but she had an experience where she had terrible allergies, and a lot of things improved during the first 5 months after the potentiation piece, but she still had her allergies, right? And she's like, what's going on? How can I be getting improvement over here? And then, I'm having problems over there. And then she does articulation, which is the second activation at the 5 month mark. And the next day, all of the allergies are just simply gone.
wow.
They're just gone. She could eat whatever she wants to, and they never come back, right? Which is just mind blowing. And then you get
Mm,
into some very bizarre stuff. Like I've been tracking some, because this is not again, this is like some kind of quantum phenomenon where you're just rolling the dice on what's going to happen, and it probably has to do with a million different aspects of the psyche, the personality, the energy body, possibly past lives. Who knows? There's so many things, contracts, other things that might be coming into play in this incarnation. So
mm,
it's very interesting. But we've seen a lot of people experience, pretty radical. They've reported anyway, radical physical strengthening and that sort of thing. We've had a lot of people who have reported cavities healing and that sort of thing. And just recently, we had the kind of Mac Daddy of that sort of thing, where there is a woman. She's a healer herself, and she's on Facebook, and she appears legitimate to me. And she claims to have regrown multiple teeth from the work.
ooh,
And you know that Garayev's work is fascinating. On his website right now, you can go over to the Wave Genetics site and look at the studies they did with canine, with regrowing canine teeth.
mm,
And there's pictures of the teeth coming in and all this stuff, and it's really, really wild. So that was my first experience of that. I really didn't want to believe it, but then I had a lot of dialogue with her, and I thought, well, I don't think she's lying, you know.
mm,
So I mean, I don't know what to make of that, but it's the only time I know that that's happened, or that's been reported to have happened.
yeah.
So
I
it's one of
mean,
the totally anomalous things.
exactly. And it's like, well, that doesn't make sense if the world is a material construct like materialists think it is. It makes much more sense if you look at the world, and I mean the world as in, the cosmos and the multiverse, whatever, as a construct of information, informational codes, which can be rewritten, recoded, and altered, like, like we see in the Matrix. That's when it starts to make much more sense. So yeah, that's very cool. That's a very cool experience that woman was, able to share with you. And
Yeah, I was fascinated. I mean, and you've obviously read the materials and you've been doing this for a long time. I mean, I write a lot about rewriting or repatterning or recoding the energy field, and then having that new coding change our quote unquote reality. That's the whole point, is you change the blueprint, and then reality can't help but change some way.
yeah, exactly. It's interesting to me that, to factor in the idea of the so-called, higher self, or that next level of the fractal, that because there's a lot of evidence that we choose to, incarnate into these, biological suits and have an experience, and that people have pre-selected certain types of paths and certain types of experiences to be able to harvest a certain type of experience and take that information back, and then it modifies the soul construct or whatever. And that maybe one of the reasons one person experiences something like that but the next person doesn't is because it would interfere with their chosen path, and it's not time for them to veer off that yet. They've got to play it out first and then get that data, get that experience, and then they can move on to something else. Who knows? Like you said, there's a million different variables. And
yeah, like even if you wanted to say, okay, higher self is a kind of slippery concept. Where does it live? I know that there's different models, but what if the higher self is ultimately the eagle or the creator or whatever? Then
yeah,
that creator is saying, okay, you're going into life, and this is another avenue of experience, and these are going to be your challenges. Some you can change, some you cannot, basically, and it's up to you to figure that out and to move forward. And that's going to be your experience. And then I'm going to harvest that experience of consciousness at some point, and it's going to benefit my ongoing creation.
Yeah, exactly. And people go, oh, well, it seems a bit brutal. Some people get really rough hands in life. And sure. It's like, well, when you look at it in terms of the infinite, that one life, that little time frame is so infinitely small. The rest of your experience is, obviously an infinitude of other options. But in between lives, if we just use the earthly reference frame and reincarnation, in between lives, your experience is so completely removed from any kind of suffering or pain. I mean, in general terms, I mean, there are some certain exceptions to this at a low level, but generally speaking, we are free of the burdens and the pain and the challenges. So that little life of tough, what do you call it? Going through the school of hard knocks is just such a blink of an eye. And the rest of the time, the lack of time, the no time, the eternity that we have is just so much more blissful. And that's what comes to us through multiple different traditions and cultures, is when you connect with those deeper levels, you have a level of profound peace that is just unmatched. And people, that's why so many near-death experiences are pissed off to come back to their body, because it was so much better on the other side.
That's right. I know Jason Brashears is a little bit on this wavelength, where he just feels like, when we finish this sim and go wherever we're going, that's kind of like going home, or at least a home. And there's a lot to be said for that. And I know a lot of people have taken comfort in that way of looking at things. And the mystical traditions also provide a similar storyline that a lot of people have taken comfort in. And I think, there's a lot to be explored there. I think even in the shamanism that I've been talking about, there are elements to that do add up with this idea of another world that you go into, and you have different experiences and that sort of thing. So there does seem to be a kind of worldwide consensus on the basic concept here, that there is something that happens after we die, that we experience where we experience a different way of being for some period of time.
Yeah, completely. And a lot of people have documented that through their so-called astral travels while they've been alive, and they come back and they produce evidence and information that is not explainable through any other means, other than there is obviously some other level of reality that exists, some other type of experience available that is inhabited, or a realm that is inhabited by many other beings. And then bigger picture, it's like, well, you just have these different layers of the fractal, and there are so many other places you can be. Even within the occult traditions of like theosophy and what have you, is like the astral plane is divided into 7 primary subplanes, but each subplane is divided into 7 more, and so on ad infinitum. Right. So you're still faced with infinity at the end of the day, and that's why it's so interesting, is because the bigger the picture that you build, the more you realize there's just an endless variety of experiences that open up to us once we're separated, once the consciousness unit is separated from the physical avatar.
Now, you go into a lot of this research in book 1 of The Grand Illusion, and you're working on finishing book 2, and I've really been looking forward to that. can you give us any sneak peek of when that's going to show up, or where are you in the process of publishing that?
Yeah, I'm kind of like it's too big and I need color. So I'm hoping, I'm not going to force it. I forced it with CGI when I had like a certain idea of when I wanted it to be published. I'm not going to do that this time. So it might be like late this year. It might be early next year.
Okay.
Um, I want it to be. I don't want it to be any later than early next year because I already 2 books ahead of what I'm actually publishing. So I need to just get this out of my head and move forward.
Yes, yes. So you've got another book beyond this one?
Yeah, I mean, it will be a progression of book two. It's essentially it's going to be like a trilogy, but nonfiction. So it will get much more into the simulation idea, exploring the collective unconscious, the quantum information field, and related ideas. I want to pick apart some of the astral fantasia stuff and put some of the Gnostic ideas and what have you in perspective, and maybe explore some of the biblical stuff as well. I could potentially pull apart some of the ancient aliens things and biblical experiences of the heavens and this type of stuff. I mean, it all kind of fits together. So it's going to be a pretty interesting project when it's done.
I really, really look forward to it. I will, of course, help publicize that when it comes out and
Appreciate that.
share that around. This has been a lot of fun. I think we're probably at a good stopping point. People's minds are probably a little bloated with info at the moment and concepts, or at least some people. We'll let people go and digest this pretty in-depth chat, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. It's always refreshing to be able to kind of talk on the same page.
Yeah, right on, and catch up a little bit. Let's not go so long the next time. I want more updates of just stupid stuff. Life in Mexico. I used to live there, so I can be a fly on the wall.
Yeah. All right. We'll do that.
All right. Well, listen, until the next time, take care of yourself. Be well. Much love.
Thanks, mate. Cheers.